So Prevent, the government's anti-extremism watchdog, or at least that's what it's meant to be, has declared cultural nationalism a right-wing terrorist ideology. In a screenshot first reported by The Telegraph from the government's Prevent Duty training, which is mandatory spot the signs of radicalization training that civil servants, but also safeguarding leads and teachers in schools undergo, they list under extreme right-wing terrorist ideologies, which they define as the active or vocal support of ideologies that advocate discrimination or violence against minority groups. They list the three following. Cultural nationalism, defined as Western culture is under threat from mass migration and a lack of integration by certain ethnic and cultural groups. Number 2, white or ethno-nationalism, mass migration from the non-white world and demographic change poses an existential threat to the white race and Western culture. And white supremacism, the white race is biologically, culturally, and spiritually superior to all other races. An alternative form of government ranging from fascist regimes to ethno-tribalism should replace Western parliamentary democracy. Now, before we deconstruct all of those bogus definitions, you might be wondering, how on earth would they be so bold and brazen to declare contempt for me on a government website? And well, if you're wondering that, you may not be aware of the insidious Islamic activist networks that have hijacked not only Prevent, but its parent body Raiku within the Home Office and dictate counter-terror policy, they dictate media coverage in the aftermath of terror attacks, and they gaslight the host majority population into not looking back in anger in order to ensure that Islam and Muslims living in Britain do not come under any scrutiny or criticism for how their faith might have inspired the jihadists who claim the lives of their daughters. But looking at these definitions, looking at the extreme right-wing terror definition overall, you have there baked into it multiple fallacies. So, first, we define extreme right-wing terrorism as the active or vocal support of ideologies. So, speech and violence are identical in their eyes. So, supporting cultural nationalism is the same as attacking a refugee child. Okay? This is just designed to create blockades to their ideological revolution, their wholesale substitution of your culture, your faith, and your heritage with foreign cultures and foreign faiths and foreign peoples, which is, I mean, if you take away the tools of being able to object to this policy, then what do you get but unilateral disarmament of the native host population who have voted against mass migration and multiculturalism in every election and referendum since 1974. If you disarm them of their ability to push back against these unwanted policies, then the only outcome is the policy continuing apace. Now notice that extreme right-wing is defined as support of ideologies that advocate discrimination or violence against minority groups. Right, okay. So the inequality of outcome between ethnic, racial, and religious groups is akin to violence. So this bakes in the blank slate anthropology of our liberal, egalitarian ruling class, which believes that every single human being is identical and that differences are only a result of the accident of geography, the injustice of economic inequality, and a deficit of education. And all of those things can be corrected by taking everyone from everywhere, bringing them to Britain, basking them in the glow of end-of-history liberal pluralism, and through cultural osmosis and state subsidies and handouts, they will become as indistinguishably British as you and me. And the only thing stopping that from happening is you noticing the cultural differences between peoples. So actually, racism is the most grievous sin because it's the only thing standing in the way of an egalitarian utopia. If you just stop complaining about the fact that they're importing jihadists, even the most ardent jihadist will have his heart melted by British values. It is an insane axiom of faith that our ruling class buys in wholesale, and when met with the inevitable consequences of their unwanted policies, rather than reassess, they double down and censor and scapegoat you as a far-right extremist for not going along with it. And then, what's most interesting is when they say against minority groups, the insinuation there is that there are oppressor and oppressed classes. So the idea is that it bakes in a cultural Marxist worldview into the definition of what is not extreme. So if you do not seek to level all perceived power, status, and wealth differences between minority and majority groups, or oppressor and oppressed groups, you are an extremist, you are right wing, you are viewed as a terrorist, according to the government's counter-terror watchdog, which all civil servants are being trained to believe. And then under cultural nationalism, of course, it says Western culture, which itself is in scare quotes, as if that sort of thing doesn't exist. There's no distinct lineage, there's no identity, there's no philosophical continuity between Athens, Rome, and Bethlehem or Jerusalem, and therefore your identity, your culture means nothing, and we can reconfigure and redefine it as suits us. That is the aim of what they're doing here. They are gaslighting you out of defending what you love. They are trying to strip away any justification for you having something particular that they cannot meddle with and include themselves in. And so, the cultural nationalism definition also demands that you don't notice any difference, any qualitative differences between the peoples who come here. So, a boat full of Eritrean and Afghan migrants who have broken into the country via the English Channel, who have paid a Hawala financier and a people smuggler to give them illegal entry on Dover Beach. They are completely indistinguishable from a family of Hong Kong refugees or an Australian who has come over on a temporary work visa. All of these people are in the category immigrant, and all of these immigrants may be of different ethnic and cultural groups, and the increasing plurality of these ethnic and cultural groups is cited as the sole strength of Britain, being diversity. But if you notice those differences in ethnicity and culture and say that they have some downsides, well, then suddenly you're a terrorist. And that's the point. It is meant to be so that the only acceptable belief by the state is one of the positive affirmation of mass migration, multiculturalism, and the substitution of your culture for foreign cultures, who are celebrated as being stronger than yours, meaning the absence of those foreign cultures makes you weak and incapable of being justified on your own terms. I mean, I don't understand how that's anything but contempt for the indigenous host population of Britain, who I think are generally decent people with an admirable culture and who should be grateful to have inherited so many accomplishments from their forebears. But no, even expressing appreciation for that, distinct from the post-war cosmopolitan diversity worship, is itself an act of terrorism, apparently. And then the other two definitions are totally rubbish as well. I don't abide by these. I know my friend Andrew Gold, when speaking to Konstantin Kissin, mistakenly called me an ethno-nationalist in his podcast in a section he's now removed as a way of good faith apology. But I'm neither an ethno nor a civic nationalist. I think that's a false binary. I think the phrase ethno-nationalist is held up to mean racist as a kind of straw man, which liberal civic nationalists who want to abolish the concept of any national identity with limits and exclusive parameters, they hold up ethno-nationalism as something to say, oh, isn't that scary? We're the only legitimate position, as the Home Office is doing here with cultural nationalism. However, when they try and define white and ethno-nationalism and white supremacism, it's totally moronic because they've separated them out into two distinct categories. But white supremacism references the term ethno-tribalism. So it's almost impossible to render them distinct when one definition uses the other definition's term in its definition. These people are not the brightest, but when you're ideologically bankrupt and can rely on ready-to-hand excuses for your own oppression and the reason why you need to seek power, wealth, and status over your ideological enemies, well, it doesn't take much in the way of critical thinking, does it? And then it insinuates, of course, that authoritarianism, fascism, all of these forms of government, ethno-preferentialism, are the domains of the extreme right wing. Now, if they mean hierarchy as the domain of the right wing, that is true, because the thing that separates left and right is the right respect natural hierarchies, and the left have what T.S. Eliot would have called the leveling impulse, the desire to eradicate all preferential arrangement of things, aiming at absolute equality, founded on the faulty anthropology of the blank slate that believes that all human beings started free and equal, and somewhere along the way the hidden hand of bigotry and oppression pried us all apart, inflicted upon us the injustice of property, and if we would just renounce all of our possessions and stop noticing differences, we'd live in John Lennon's Imagine. So unless they're saying that hierarchy is the domain of the right wing, they labour under serious philosophical misapprehensions, or just bad faith interpretations of their political opponents, because Italian fascism was not itself a racial doctrine, and it came out of the Paris communes and the Marxist trade unions, so fascism is neither the domain of the right, nor is the domain of ethno or white supremacists, and the idea that ethnic preferentialism is itself the domain of white Europeans, I mean, in repeated surveys, such as the Ipsos Mori polling that came out a couple of years ago, we see that particularly the British, but all across Europe, they have much lower levels of ethnic consciousness and much lower levels of opposition to foreign religions than the people that have been imported into their midst. And then the Home Office would like you to pretend that importing people from those tribal regions with high levels of ethnic in-group preference will have absolutely no impact on Western parliamentary democracy. It's all a farce just to get you to shut up about the mass immigration experiment that they are running on our country. With a definition, by the way, which would then classify current Labour Prime Minister Keir Starmer as a cultural nationalist, because he classified mass migration as an open borders experiment which is turning Britain into a nation of strangers. Not that he's actually going to do anything about it, because remember, he's outsourcing all of his policies to be decided by these civil servants who have been trained on this ideology. However, in just rhetoric alone, I expect he'll be getting a knock on the door and a non-crime hate incident and be referred to Prevent by the end of the afternoon. Now, a Home Office spokesperson responded to this reporting in the Telegraph, and they said, Prevent is not about restricting debate or free speech, but about protecting those susceptible to radicalisation. Now, excuse me if I disbelieve you when the definitions that you're basing radicalisation on are this absurd, ill thought through, and politically motivated. Who's doing this? Who specifically within the Home Office is doing this? Well, as Stephen Edgington and I have reported on before, the Home Office is riddled with an Islamic network. So it's got over 700 members, and it aims to, in its own words, influence policymakers to support Muslim needs. It aims to promote a clear understanding of generic Islam, provide advice and guidance to senior civil service management on religious issues that affect Muslim staff, and facilitate and support Home Office engagement with external stakeholders from Muslim communities. So it picks and chooses which are the legitimate representatives of the British Muslim community that the state has to engage with, which almost always idea launders from extreme groups up the chain of command to state policy. A perfect example of this is the Muslim Vote Organization, which was meant to be an ostensibly neutral body that just motivates Muslims to vote along Muslim lines. But it was shaped by members of Hizb ut-Tahrir, the proscribed group who stood on the streets of London in the aftermath of October 7th, causing for Muslim armies to rise up for jihad. And they were prescribed in early 2024 by the Conservative government, after originally, when it was attempted to be prescribed by a previous Conservative government, when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, Keir Starmer wrote to the European Convention on Court of Human Rights on behalf of Hizb ut-Tahrir and said that they are one of many voices that need to be heard. Well, Hizb ut-Tahrir, an extremist organisation that William Shawcross credited in his report for disarming Prevent in its attempts to police Islamic extremism, they helped inform the Muslim Vote Organisation, who helped 4 independent Gaza-obsessed Muslim MPs get elected at the last election. So you can see a chain of continuity from extremist Muslim groups to government policy and parliament. Now, in this reporting by Stephen Edgington, he notes that yes, it has exceeded 700 members, and other staff members working in the Home Office, including one whistleblower, are very uncomfortable about having to work with them, because they say having an Islamic lobby group inside the Home Office represents a serious threat to the government's aims in combating Islamic extremism and granting asylum to those fleeing Islamic countries over religious persecution. The network has already produced pro-hijab propaganda, which it sent to asylum seeker decision makers in the Home Office, and explicitly states its aim is to influence policy to support their religious goals. And they also focus on hiring more Muslim members of staff. And one of these members of staff, in a seminar last year at King's College London, said that Prevent is inherently racist because it focuses on Islamic extremism. And then later in that same seminar, when the seminar attendees were played ISIS propaganda videos as an example of Islamist extremism, that member of staff pointed at the screen and laughed and said, "I know him, he went to my school." So the British state is putting in charge of asylum decisions and counter-terror policy Muslim members of staff who hire other Muslim members of staff who went to school with ISIS terrorists and find it funny. And you wonder why cultural nationalism by the British host majority is deemed terrorism by those people. It is because we have Muslim activists embedded at the highest levels of the state dictating what you can and cannot say about immigration, multiculturalism, and of course, Islam. And one of these people, in an expose recently by Cathy Ginnell at The Conservative Woman and by Christian Concern, one of these people misrepresented the relative safety of a Muslim country to Christians to try to block a Christian asylum seeker who is fleeing forced conversion to Islam from gaining the right to stay in the country. Now, we can have a debate as to whether or not Britain should be accepting any refugees from a nation that it doesn't border. I am personally in favour of amending the 1952 Refugee Convention from the UN that says that you have to seek asylum in your continent of origin. However, it shows that the asylum system, I mean, the purpose of the system is what it does. The purpose of the asylum system is to admit an increasing number of Muslims into Britain while deterring Christians fleeing Muslim persecution. So the asylum system is not a neutral application of the rule of law. It is a way for Muslims to enter the country, facilitated by other Muslim members of staff who have a very strong ethno and religious consciousness about themselves being Muslims and members of the Ummah, the global Muslim race as they see it. I would not like to see it that way. I would not like any of this corruption to be in my government in the first place, but unfortunately, thanks to diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, and thanks to the long march of Islamic advocates through our institutions, they're here and they're making decisions. And I suppose this would explain why in Prevent's glossary of terms, as has been for a long time, not only is cultural nationalism featured, but if you go to the Islamist terrorism section, it's very revealing how they treat it. So, Islamist terrorism is the threat or use of violence as a means to establish a strict interpretation of an Islamic society. For some, this is a political ideology which envisions, for example, the creation of a global Islamic caliphate based on strict implementation of Sharia law. Many adherents believe that violence, or jihad, as they conceive it, is not only a necessary strategic tool to achieve their aims, but an individual's religious duty. In the UK, the Islamist terrorist threat comes overwhelmingly from those inspired by, but not necessarily affiliated with, Daesh or Al-Qaeda, but they operate within a wider landscape of radicalizing influences as set out by the government's response to the independent review of Prevent. And this is the most telling part. Islamists should not be interpreted as a reference to individuals who follow the religion of Islam. Right, so they are saying there is no ideological connective tissue between jihadists and jihad as written in the Quran and Hadiths. They are saying that anyone who commits a terror attack in the name of Islam is incorrectly interpreting the Quran and is incorrectly justifying their beliefs by referring to the texts of Islam. Whereas they are not quite so lenient on the description of cultural nationalism, because if you think that your culture, as you see it, is under threat from foreign cultures, you are a terrorist. So never mind people who cite verses from the Quran and Hadiths to then commit acts of terrorism. No. That has absolutely nothing to do with Islam. But if you are worried about the impact of, say, Islam on Western culture, first of all, Western culture doesn't exist. See the scare quotes that your government has put it in. But two, you are a terrorist. So if you express concern about immigration, you're a terrorist. But if you blow up a pop concert and shout Allahu Akbar, you're apparently not a Muslim. Do you see the insidious dawah, the idea laundering to advance the aims of Islam that is happening in the UK? It's state-level systemic gaslighting that is going on. And it's not just for the reasons of keeping community cohesion. That is a liberal egalitarian Trojan horse being used by Islamic activists to advance the cause of Islam. Now, who runs Prevent? Prevent is governed by a parent body called Raiku. Now, you can get the full history of Raiku in this article here that I did quite some time ago in November 2024 for Courage Media, but to give a brief overview, it was reconfigured by the Cameron and May government by Richard Chalk, who was the chief of staff to the head of the Conservative Party, then Sayeeda Vorsi, now Baroness Vorsi, an independent peer in the House of Lords. Chalk had just come off of deployment in Baghdad, in Iraq, running classified psychological warfare operations on the population there, and brought his insights back. And what Raiku does, Raiku is the Research, Information and Communications Unit within the Home Office. It runs psychological warfare operations in the aftermath of terror attacks to convince the British public that Islam is not to blame. So it controls media coverage, it runs prefabricated hashtag campaigns and organises events. It busses imams out to the site of terror attacks to ensure that British people have a positive view of Islam even after some jihadist has blown up a pop concert. And I say pop concert because in 2017, Prevent themselves were involved in organising the message and the event of the Don't Look Back in Anger concert in Manchester Arena. So yes, the government was telling the grieving parents of the victims of Manchester Arena bombing, don't look back in anger and do not blame Islam. And we know this because disaster planner Lucy Easthope wrote that she had regretted how quickly that she and other members of Raiku had rolled out the message of we will survive, we will resist, resilience, and don't look back in anger after the bombing had gone on. So they, even those people have, sometimes guilty consciences. But without that, we wouldn't know that they were doing this. Prime example of this as well is this front page here. So when British aid worker Alan Henning was beheaded on video by ISIS in 2014, the Sun newspaper ran this image of a woman in a Union Jack hijab. Now, this had not been made for that front page. It had been made by the UK Home Office, quote, to promote the true face of Islam among vulnerable UK communities. So it defines Islam as vulnerable, worthy of state protection, and then it says, we get to define the actual vision of Islam, which is a woman in a Union Jack hijab. Never mind the fact that the hijab, niqab, and burqa, and all modesty and veiling practices in Islam are inflicted upon women with the premise that men's sexual appetites are so uncontrollable that they have to dress themselves in bin liners lest they have sexual violence visited upon them. But apparently, this is the true face of Islam, as told to you by the government, as forced to be put on the front page of a newspaper after an ISIS terror attack to ensure that you do not have a negative opinion of Islam when a Muslim cuts a man's head off on camera. Now, this was created, and we know this via Freedom of Information requests sent to Raiku. This was created by the Inspire charity under the hashtag Making a Stand campaign. Raiku called this image our product, by the way. And the Inspire campaign was run by Dame Sarah Khan, a former anti-extremism advisor for the government, whose sister just so happens to have been deputy head of Raiku, Sabrina Khan. Now, you can find out a bit more about Sarah Khan in some more of my reporting on Raiku here, and as we can see, former Home Secretary and Prime Minister Theresa May is standing next to Sarah Khan at the launch of the Making a Stand campaign, where the image was first debuted before it was repurposed for the Sun newspaper front page. And Raiku have done this with a bunch of terror attacks and high-profile incidents, including the London Bridge attack in 2017, the Westminster Bridge attacks, the Manchester Arena bombing, and it's suspected to have been used in the 2023 Nottingham stabbing and the 2024 Southport murders. And I say this because this, in the immediate aftermath of Valdo Calacane killing 2 children and a caretaker, this was the event that was suddenly mobilised with the hashtag Nottingham Together, One City, with all of the faith leaders lined up behind the grieving parents, and the parents trotted out and told to say, never hold hate in your heart for any race or religion. It's like, well, sorry, it it wasn't at the time necessarily confirmed that this was an Islamic terror attack, and it turns out that Valdo Calacane was just a murderous schizophrenic who had nothing to do with Islam. Very strange how this massive event needed to be put on to tell the public, don't blame Islam for this attack because you're noticing patterns here. Now, this particular piece reports mainly on a report that was released by Raiku, or rather leaked, but written by Raiku, in the aftermath of the Southport murders and subsequent protests last summer, and Home Secretary Yvette Cooper had commissioned this report. The paper was titled Counter-Extremism Sprint, Understand, a juxtaposition in terms, of course, because how can you sprint while seeking to understand and taking careful consideration of things? And it was a overview of extremism in Britain and the threats that it posed. And the paper claimed that right-wing extremist narratives, particularly around immigration and policing, are in some cases leaking into mainstream debates. These narratives included anti-communism, cultural nationalism, and believing that Western culture is under threat from mass migration. So these definitions, by Prevent, have been in the oven at the Home Office for quite some time. The grooming gang scandal, the Pakistani grooming gang scandal, was dismissed as a grievance narrative that was being exploited by right-wing extremists to promote anti-Muslim sentiment as well as anti-government and anti-political correctness narratives. So they dismissed out of hand the well-documented and egregious Pakistani grooming gang scandal, and we wonder when their chief concern is to ensure that the Muslim communities in Britain never have their reputation impugned. We wonder why that might be the case. We wonder what the motivation there might be to distract from the well-documented and ongoing atrocities committed by Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs in the UK. In 2025, the full details got leaked to Policy Exchange, and the authors, this is Andrew Gilligan and Dr. Paul Slott, take care to note in there that Islamists have been responsible for 94% of all deaths and 88% of injuries caused by terrorism since 1999, and that they comprise 80% of counter-terror police and 75% of MI5's open caseload, and 63% in terrorists in custody. Bear in mind, only 10% of counter-terror police and 25% of MI5's open caseload are far-right extremists, and as we know here, far-right extremists is pretty poorly defined. So it's interesting then that Prevent referrals show far-right extremists being referred at higher rates than Islamists, even though Islamists remain the most numerous and most violent terror threat in the UK, in Europe, and in the world. They are overwhelmingly responsible for the majority of deaths and injuries by terrorism. And just as we have increased the number of migrants from Islamic areas, especially since 2021, thanks to the Boris wave, mysteriously, the level of Islamic terrorism somehow goes down. Now that doesn't make sense. It only makes sense if Prevent are selectively no longer investigating it. And it shows you what their priorities are, because in that report, the report that I mentioned in this article here, only one page and one case study are dedicated to Islamist extremism. This is the same to conspiracy theories, Sikh separatism, misogyny, and environmentalism. Islamist terror only got 160 words of coverage and one case study. 320 words, however, were dedicated to a single incident of school bullying on so-called Punish a Muslim Day. And they cited Tell Mama as well, the anti-Islamophobia charity that accused Boris Johnson of causing a spike in Muslim hate crimes after his letterbox column. And this was based on self-reported call-ins to a hotline that required no police reports, evidence, or follow-up. So they are just, again, Islamic propagandists, and yet the Home Office thinks that one incident of school bullying, according to Tell Mama, that warrants more time than actual Islamic terror attacks. Again, things like London Bridge attack, Manchester Arena bombing, not mentioned. But they did dedicate 430 words to an anti-immigration sticker campaign, presumably Sam Melia's. Now, excuse me if I think that stickers are of a lower priority than bombings and beheadings. This is all after Sir William Shawcross released the Shawcross Report, his independent review of Prevent in 2023, and he said, although Islamist terrorism is currently the largest terrorist threat facing the United Kingdom, Prevent is not doing enough to counter non-violent Islamist extremism. And of course, the non-violent Islamist extremism, the dawah preached in mosques and madrasas in this country, converts very readily into Islamist terror. However, if you notice, the definition of Islamist extremism is to decouple words and scripture and Islamist teaching from the terror attacks done in the name of Islam, whereas if you're alarmed about your culture coming under threat by immigration and multiculturalism, the policies of the state, then those are definitely linked. So your culture and its concerns are inextricable from you being a violent right-wing terrorist that beats up refugee children. Now, Shawcross noted in his review of Prevent, the present boundaries around what is termed by Prevent as extremist Islamist ideology are being drawn too narrowly, while the boundaries around the ideology of the extreme right wing are too broad. And this is 100% the case. Because remember when that Home Office official responded to the Telegraph and said, "We're not out to censor free speech"? Bear in mind, Prevent compiled a list a couple of years ago of actively patriotic and proud texts, that's the word they used, that are apparently frequented by far-right extremists. And they included, and I'm not joking, Beowulf, The Lord of the Rings, C.S. Lewis, Douglas Murray, Peter Hitchens, Melanie Phillips, John Locke's two treatises, Michael Portillo's Great British Railway Journeys, Yes Minister, Brave New World, and without a hint of irony, George Orwell's 1984, which has just got a brand new trigger warning, of course, presumably because they took Prevent's warnings that, reading about the rise of English socialism will lead to far-right extremism very seriously. And after this has happened, Colonel Richard Kemp has already criticised Prevent before, but he said that Prevent, in trying to emphasise far-right extremism rather than Islamic extremism, in the interests of trying to appear even-handed and appease people that criticise the Prevent programme for focusing on Islamic extremists, it has led to the number of far-right referrals for pensioners to increase by 90%. The idea that pensioners are on the precipice of going out and committing Anders Breivik-style neo-Nazi terror attacks is absurd, and I think Richard Kemp is attributing a lack of ill motive here, just saying, they're trying to be fair, they're for political reasons, they're trying to ensure that the demand of right-wing terrorism is matched by an inflated supply. No, I think this is ill-motivated by the Islamic network, who seem to be deprioritizing the monitoring of Islamic terrorism because they believe that it's racist, and they believe that a less scrupulous eye cast on the activities, as Baroness Vorsi once said, although not illegal, definitely illiberal activities of certain Muslim groups in Britain, they believe that this will advantage Islam in the long run, and they themselves, in their mission statement for the Islamic network, say that they want to advance the cause of Islam, so there you go. And this is why multiple terrorists have evaded detection, and most famously, of course, is Axel Rudakabana, who received 3 Prevent referrals between 2019 and 2021 for his obsession with ISIS and genocides. No action was taken, and Prevent officers had misspelled his name, so they couldn't see the previous referrals in the system. Actually, the former head of Prevent resigned over this matter very recently. And of course, Abi Harbi Ali, the son of a Somalian diplomat who killed Sir David Amess MP in his constituency in Southend in 2021. Abi's father was the former director of media and communications for the former Prime Minister of Somalia and worked on counter-extremism operations against al-Shabaab. So, would have thought that he would be a high-profile person on the government's anti-extremism watchdog's radar. In a coroner's report in July 2024, it found that Ali was reported to Prevent in 2014 but missed his 6-month case review after he'd already met with 2 officers in a McDonald's, and then had his case closed after a 12-month review, reporting nothing of concern. So David Amess's daughter has been denied a further inquiry and investigation into Prevent by the government, so she's bringing lawsuits forward because she has been spoken to with such disrespect and disregard by even her dad's former colleagues who would have called him friends. And remember, in the immediate aftermath of Sir David Amess's murder, what did Parliament call for? Further restrictions on online speech. They said David's law to crack down on hurty words online, not taking action against Islamic extremism, instead trying to censor critics of the government, their immigration and their multicultural management policy on Twitter. Disrespectful, disgusting, but wholly predictable for an ideologically captured government. Now, much of this happened under Dame Sarah Khan, reminder, and her sister, Sabrina. And Sarah Khan had recently released, in December of 2024, a report with our old friends, the communist activist group Hope Not Hate. Now, this report I covered here in the Radicals Redefining Extremism piece on Courage Media. She, while working at Prevent and Raiku, along with her sister, the Home Office had funded Hope Not Hate with grants of £50,000 and £141,380 in 2019 and 2020 to brief multiple departments on emerging trends in UK hate. So this is why they were working there. And then when she departs a government role, she then goes and immediately starts working with Hope Not Hate to lobby the government to proscribe her political enemies. And then also, the Home Office have funded a charity called the Paul Hamlin Foundation. Charlotte Gill's done great investigative work on this. And the Paul Hamlin Foundation gave Hope Not Hate £585,000 over 8 years to establish pro-immigration protest chapters that can respond as part of Raiku's controlled spontaneity event. So if you're thinking, for example, the sudden appearance of all of these groups during the Southport protests, all these front pages of people miraculously protesting against far-right racism in August, the fact that it ended up on the front pages the following day, and the fact that all these stand-up to racism protest chapters were marshalled overnight in response to the hundreds of far-right riots hoax that Nick Lowles admits to spreading as a hoax, but that failed to materialize. If you're wondering how all that happened, that's all connected thanks to your tax money. Me and you have been taxed to pay for the gremlins of open borders leftism to protest on behalf of policies that the Islamic network and the state already want to be in place. In this particular report, it said that cultural Marxism is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. It said, and I'll read from it, cultural Marxism is a theory alleging that those subscribing to far-left ideologies are embedded in cultural and political institutions and are working to undermine Western culture. Well, you're banning me speaking up for it, so I would think that that's evidence of it. Would you not? It continues. It says, it often posits that Jewish people have disproportionate influence within cultural institutions. No, I think that's a smokescreen, much like the term Islamophobia was meant to conjure up ideas of anti-Semitism by the Muslim Brotherhood to insulate Islam and their activists from criticism. I think you're using the term anti-Semitism as a smokescreen to cover up the fact that there is an Islamic network embedded in the government telling me that I can't defend my culture in order to advance the aims of Islam. And let me just run this thought experiment out for a moment. If cultural nationalism is a terrorist ideology, what is its antonym that is acceptable in the eyes of the state? Is it multicultural internationalism? So therefore, cultural Marxism. So at the same time, the former government counter-extremism advisor is working with a communist group, Hope Not Hate, whose head of research praised Stalin's Red Army at a Hope Not Hate event on camera in 2013. At the same time, they are producing reports to tell the government to ban talk of cultural Marxism as an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. They are also banning cultural nationalism as a terrorist ideology, which therefore only leaves cultural Marxism as the default position of the state. So if you notice that the state is practicing cultural Marxism, open borders liberalism, and Islamism, you're a racist. But if you support it, well, that's the only position the state will allow you to take, because the other position, cultural nationalism, is prescribed. It's maddening, but the point is not consistency. The point is to disarm you from complaints against what is happening to your country. As I point out in this article as well, in the paper itself, and we shouldn't expect rigorous scholarship from these people, neither of these definitions receive citations from sources that might give them a fairer hearing. For example, cultural Marxism as a term that refers to writers from the Frankfurt School, such as Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse, or the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci, who urged fellow revolutionaries to abandon wars of maneuver, that's direct action tactics, for wars of position to infiltrate the state and conduct what Rudy Dutch would call the Long March through the institutions. This was then cited as inspiration by Kimberly Crenshaw, the creator of intersectionality, as the reason for formulating critical race theory. I've just laid out a very simplified, but cited, genealogy of cultural Marxism there that anyone who is intellectually honest could have put in that paper. Didn't take me very long. Why did they not? Because they want to ban you from noticing this is what they're doing, while also leaving it as the only position which you can affirmatively support. It's not happening, and it's a good thing, as is the usual leftist dialectic. Michael Knowles, in his book Speechless, actually points out that the attempt to render the study of cultural Marxism radioactive by calling it a conspiracy theory was itself a conspiracy by left-wing academics who didn't want their forebears to be subject to public scrutiny. So Hope Not Hate are now throwing up the smokescreen of anti-Semitism to hide what they are actually doing. And it's absurd, again, that they cite anti-Semitism because Jewish academics like Yoram Hazony and Eric Kaufman, Ben Shapiro, Dennis Prager have all said that there are some liberal secular Jews who are pushing mass immigration and multiculturalism as a way to protect Jewish identity, and they think that's a bad idea, and that, yes, cultural Marxism exists, and it doesn't matter whether or not that lots of the authors themselves were Jewish. That doesn't mean that you can't criticize the ideas of cultural Marxism. If you're going to call all those guys anti-Semites, then again, you're just discrediting yourself. Now, what's the point of all this? The point of all this, of course, is to advance the goals of Islam without being subject to scrutiny. But also, and the reason it gives such purchase by the members of the state who are not themselves Muslims, like Keir Starmer, it's to crack down on talk of civil war. Now, I went over this last week. I went over the warnings by David Betts and Dominic Cummings that increased immigration, increased demographic and cultural siloing, a splintering effect that is being had on the national narrative, and this febrile pile of divisions and antagonisms that are ready to be ignited by something akin to the Southport massacre could go up as a bonfire of civil war. And the state know this. They've been briefed on this multiple times. If Dominic Cummings, former government advisor, is telling us he had meetings about it in 2019, 2020, then you can be sure that in the aftermath of Southport, Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper were told the same thing. So they have chosen instead to double down on the downgrading tactic, the diminishing of the settled indigenous white host population having the majority status in their own home. They have decided to double down on gaslighting them and telling them that they are nothing special and that they should have no advantage or ownership over their country and their culture more than someone who turned up yesterday legally on a plane or illegally on a small boat crossing the channel. And this is buried in as well in the cultural nationalism point, because it says that your Western culture, to posit that it's under threat from mass migration and lack of integration by certain ethnic and cultural groups, that demands that you don't draw any distinctions between the quality of migrants, the quantity of migrants, or the legality of migrants. So immigration in all forms is an unalloyed good according to the Home Office, except of course you're a Christian asylum seeker, and if you complain about it, you're akin to a terrorist, which means that you are withdrawing the only means of conflict resolution from the beleaguered British host majority population that then pushes these competing ethnic and cultural groups, imported tribal Islamists on one hand and the British host majority on the other, you are pushing them towards violent conflict. And I think the state knows this, and I am worried that there are Muslim activists who are thinking, yeah, that's going to happen, and we'll win this one. I mean, I don't want that to happen, but it looks like they're driving towards that absolute. So, I gained comment from the US State Department on this, because I knew that they would be concerned about it. Now, Lord Young of the Free Speech Union has raised the fact that this is an incursion on Britain's freedom of speech, and he's written to Home Secretary Yvette Cooper saying, now that cultural nationalism has been classified as a subcategory of extreme right-wing terrorist ideology, even mainstream right-of-centre beliefs risk being treated as ideologically suspect, despite falling well within the bounds of lawful expression. Topics captured under the prevent category of cultural nationalism include widely held views ranging from concerns about immigration and social cohesion to the belief that integration should be a policy priority and that shared cultural norms help sustain a liberal society. Now, that's all well and good, but they won't listen to strongly worded letters from their political opponents. What they will listen to is the guarantors of Europe's continued safety under the post-war military settlement, saying, what are we spending all this defense money for if you don't align with our strategic and value goals? So I spoke to someone at the State Department who provided the following comment. Western culture is not something to demonize, diminish, or apologize for. Rather, Americans and Europeans should honor our shared heritage of self-government, liberty, and rule of law. Extremism comes not from those who respect our traditions, but from those who seek to erase them. We must continue to uphold these beliefs and cease efforts to censor, marginalize, or stigmatize individuals for their beliefs while rejecting all violent extremism. This obviously follows J.D. Vance saying at the Munich Security Conference that he's worried about the censorship efforts taken by European governments and their intervention in democratic elections when they don't like right-wing populist candidates, using lawfare against the likes of Marine Le Pen or the candidate from Romania. And the State Department has also expressed concern recently over the arrest of Billboard Chris and my friend Lois McClatchy Miller in Brussels for protesting against the way that gender ideology preys upon children. I respect Chris's pronouns, and he likes to identify as a child safety advocate and activist, and I think he's doing very good work. They were arrested by Brussels police after a deranged leftist activist kept getting in Lois's face and trying to obstruct their camera and shouting fascist at Billboard Chris. The Brussels police arrived after they were called because this man was harassing Lois, a rather feisty yet small woman, and they turned up and they arrested both Lois and Chris and confiscated their signs instead. And in response, the US State Department issued a statement. And they said to the Daily Wire, "We are aware of these reports and are looking into the matter. The State Department strongly supports the peaceful freedom of expression for all." And in May, an official at the State Department, Sam Sampson, wrote a Substack post in a sort of unprecedented move of transparency by the American government and said, "The suppression of speech, facilitation of mass migration, targeting of religious expression, and undermining of electoral choice threatens the very foundation of the transatlantic partnership. A Europe that replaces its spiritual and cultural roots, that treats traditional values as dangerous relics, and that centralizes power in an unaccountable institution is a Europe less capable of standing firm against external threats and internal decay." So, it looks like America is questioning what the point of NATO is if Europe's populations, particularly the British government, are punishing their majority for patriotism. And so they're thinking, well, as long as you have this insidious Islamic network at the heart of your government, why on earth would we bail you out in the event of a military incursion or invasion? And so I would suggest that the ruling treacherous Labour government, who have no inclination to defend the culture or people of Britain, might reassess their plan when the US might withdraw all military support should we get ourselves in a sticky situation, because you have bullied the host population for all of its natural loves and loyalties of family, faith, community, and country for a very long time.